Welcome to another Bites with Beck and Benji. Thanks for joining us. Today's discussion is with Nick Klein, who is the Executive Director of Cyber Resilience at CyberCX, Australia and New Zealand's preeminent cybersecurity company. The conversation will be centered around the different types of cyber attacks, digital forensics, incident response, and how the two are intertwined, not to mention much more. Over to you, Beck, Benji, and Nick.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Bites with Beck and Benji. Today, we will be discussing the different nature of types of cyber attacks, as well as how one goes about uncovering what happened in these cyber attacks after they've occurred. Digital forensics is a massive, massive part of cybersecurity, and we're fortunate enough to have a guest who has been at the forefront of this for the better part of almost 3 decades now. So I'll get Beck to introduce our esteemed guest, and we'll take the conversation off from that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Benji. So please welcome our guest today, Nick Klein. So he's an internationally recognized leader in cybersecurity with, as Benji said, over 25 years experience. Nick's experience lies in digital forensics and incident response, and he's worked with the Australian Federal Police and Interpol on international investigations and intelligence operations, including counterterrorism, which is super cool. Now he's the Executive Director of Cyber Resilience at CyberCX, and Nick leads a team of digital forensics experts through probably hundreds, possibly thousands of cyber incidents per year, and he's also a certified SANS Institute instructor. What a resume. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Beth.
So, Nick, it's a fascinating field that you're involved in. For those that may be unfamiliar with the general field of DFIR or digital forensics incident response, could you give us a simple explanation of what that would entail in today's age and, how that is directly related to what occurs with some of these incidents?
Yeah, sure thing. Look, I think the best simple explanation of what we do is we solve puzzles. We're professional puzzle solvers, and we do it using digital forensic evidence. So what that means is, we get called in on a whole range of different kind of cases where ultimately you're trying to investigate something or prove something happened, or maybe something didn't happen. And there's forensic evidence or forensic artifacts, as we call them, that can help you prove or disprove what occurred. So, that could be everything from an internal investigation in a company. Maybe there's an employee who's suspected of doing something a bit dodgy, to, we do criminal matters, we do legal matters where things need to be proven or disproven, right up to, what the team's probably most well known for these days is cyber breaches. So organization gets compromised in some way, and the big questions that they need answered are things like, well, how did this happen? How did they get in? When did they get in? Are they still in our network? How do we get them out? And really, what did they do while they were inside? Did they plant backdoors that we need to remove? Did they access data that could be really sensitive that we need to notify people about? Did they steal information? Did they do other things? And that's really the focus of what the incident response team, mostly at CyberCX, does. But digital forensics in its broader sense really is just trying to investigate something using forensic evidence.
So what sparked your interest in digital forensics, Nick? You've got an amazingly long background in law enforcement. So how has the passion for this field sort of evolved over your career?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I never planned to get into this as such. And really, when I started my career, 25 plus years ago, it didn't kind of exist in its current form. So I started my professional life as an IT auditor, working for one of the big four. And it was great sort of foundational skill in what I ended up doing because, we'd be going out and reviewing computer systems mainly to support financial audits. But every week you'd be out of a new company, new industry, new technology platforms, new people, new challenges. And we were kind of exploring them and ripping them apart to see how secure they were. And then
as a foundation for what DFIR is now, to a degree.
Yeah.
Pen testing to a degree.
Yeah, well, and that, that's one that my path was one way into this field. Others have come in through pen testing. We've had system administrators who have come in. We've had people who worked in SOCs. We've had people who've come in, through other sort of related technology areas. We've had folks that have come in without that technical basis. So, and I think that's important too, because if you fast forward to what makes a really good investigations team, a diversity of thinking and backgrounds and skills is really important. If you're all the same, it makes it really hard to solve problems together because you're all kind of looking at it in the same way. So bringing in people from different places is great. But, going back to when I started, so I sort of had that initial experience from essentially IT audit. And then the internet came along, and I worked through that period in professional history where people started getting email addresses. It was a really proud thing when you can give someone a business card that had your email address on it. People say, do you have email now? You can email.
So important.
Yeah, totally. But this is also when companies started connecting themselves to the big bad internet, and IT audit kind of developed into IT security. So then what we did developed into areas like pen testing. So, I did a lot of pen testing in the very early days where we would be testing the people's systems, finding the holes that the attackers would use, and starting to work on those initial areas of then responding to security breaches that occur. So that's kind of how I came into it. But then I went down that investigation path ultimately to, digital forensics and sort of cyber breach. The reasons I do it, I mean, top of the list, I think it's super fun, right?
It is
fun based on the way you kind of describe it and the people involved and the different perspectives. It sounds like it could just be a riot of fun.
Like I've only touched on it in a small way, like in a bit of DFIR training, but as someone who can hyper-focus on a task, going through logs and things like that, I would just spend hours doing it and be like, I've just found so much stuff. Now what? What do I do with it now?
Yeah, totally. Look, it's really fun. It's really challenging. It's very real world, right? It's not like the movies at all. It's not like, you press a few buttons and the answer kind of presents itself.
The hacking and security, they're in the system.
That's right. On the big magic screens that you have. You spend a lot of time, like I've done a lot of teaching, and I always say to people, if you're not going down rabbit holes, if you're not wasting time chasing things that don't get you anywhere, you're not playing hard enough, right? Because part of good investigation is you're exploring all those avenues, you're trying all those things, and you do spend a lot of time chasing things that don't get you anywhere. But, you kind of think they don't get you anywhere, but you're learning about the system, the platform, the environment, that kind of stuff, and you're building your skills.
The incident and
totally.
The story itself that uncovered. I imagine it would be pretty challenging as well coming to support organizations where you say, can we look at your logs? And the response is, what logs? How do you support those organizations that I guess weren't set up for the remediation required for some of these incidents?
Yeah, it can be difficult. The best way to approach what we do is think about what the situation is, what it is you're investigating. Think about all the places where evidence could be or should be, and then go out and grab it all. And then you inevitably hit those challenges. Well, we don't have that log, or we've got that log, but it's in its really basic format. So there's not a lot of retention. There's not a lot of detail in the fields, or things like, we have these fantastic logs out of our load balancer that show you history hitting this page for the last 12 months. But then you look at it and you go, well, they're all like internal IP addresses. We don't really translate the external one. So it's great, you've got this log of all this activity, but we can't really tell what's what. And you need to use other fields, analysis techniques, right? And other things that are less for us. But that also shows that, what we do is deeply, deeply technical. You got to love. So Becky talked about, spending hours poring over logs. Mm-hmm. That's kind of good investigations is really, really deeply low-level technical. And it comes back to what I said at the start. At the end of the day, you're solving a puzzle and you try to find the pieces and stitch them together and figure out what means what's useful, what's not. But, when it comes together and you start seeing the story emerge of what actually happened, that's when you realize you're doing a good job and you're getting somewhere and you're starting to get those answers. And that's when it really sort of all pulls together, which is amazing, which is great, and we love it.
Yeah, it is really exciting. I did an incident response competition not long ago, and it just sort of consumed like a week of my life, but it was totally worth it. I had the best time, and watching the story come together and then sort of doing all of even just the comms stuff as well, like, because you have to look at all of the CVEs that were like, hit on the incident and things like that. There was a lot to it, and I was just so surprised how much there was involved and how much fun it could be.
And that's another thing too, is you bounce around a lot of areas. So, When you work with really good people in this field, or a really good team, they bounce from one thing to another all the time as they're chasing these different, pulling these different threads. So you might start with some interest, an interesting log detection where you've got some weird authentication, and then you jump to where else is this account being used across the network, and you pick a box, and then you start looking at it, and you see access to files or folders, and then you see weird executables, and then you jump into that, and then you're jumping onto another platform to get IOCs, and then you're hunting again across the network. So you're kind of constantly moving around, and the knowledge that you need to have, not across different technical areas, is pretty extensive. And it's difficult, right? Because the platforms that we investigate are getting bigger and more complex. So in 1 minute, you'll be looking at logs, and then the next minute you're looking down in, master file table information on NTFS file systems to look at particular timestamps to correlate a log entry to see what time something happened. And then you're bouncing into something that shows when an executable was run. And then you're jumping over here to see when a link file was triggered that shows the person might have been in a particular folder. And you're kind of doing this on an enterprise level as well. It's both challenging and rewarding at the same time, but that's kind of the, forensics is often described as it's half science and it's half kind of black art. And when you see it at its best, you can see that kind of come together, but it just works, and it's pretty amazing. So
how has, devices such as, things like Internet of Things kind of complicated investigations? Because now you've got things like biometrics, you've got wearables, things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You see, whenever there's some new technology or new capability, you see that starting to emerge. But the reality is, the vast majority of attacks that, when you think about just cyber breaches, the vast majority of attacks that, like the CyberCX team would do, any team would do, is really still on fundamental technologies and platforms. Yeah, that's right. Just because we now have IoT, it's not like there's this massive pivot by all cyber criminals to now compromising our internet light bulbs and fridges and stuff like that. It's like, why bother? Because all of their tools and techniques and methods and the things that they know are based on all the older stuff, and it works, right? So that's where the majority of breach activity occurs. That's not to say we don't see more sophisticated attacks. I mean, we've done, the incident response team, we've done jobs where we've seen sophisticated attacks into things like switches, network routers, gateways, power supply units, all sorts of weird and wonderful things. It's usually the more sophisticated end of the attackers that you're looking for. But that's also tricky too, because, if you go into a network that's compromised, you tend to look for the obvious stuff and the stuff that you're used to seeing. And sometimes that can be a bit of a false positive, because, well, not a false positive, but it can give you a false sense of security because you don't know what else is there. And it's one of the challenges of forensics. Like you said, you could spend a week investigating stuff and you'll find all these things, but there's no kind of easy answer. It's not like a capture the flag where it goes, yes, you found the answer. It's like
step 1, step 2. Yeah.
Great. You found some stuff, but what else is there? It's like, you don't know. And you could spend a week looking and find a whole bunch of other stuff, or you could spend 6 months looking and not find anything else. And that's part of the challenges of what we do is you never know when you've really found every answer, which is again part of that kind of art and black art and science, right?
I imagine as well, to a degree, the sophistication element when they start linking different vulnerabilities. So like CVE here is targeted for infiltration, but then the privilege escalation occurs here with this CVE. So there's a degree of, have we found the initial breadcrumb, the initial access that caused this chain of events?
Yeah, totally. But that's where, again, it's interesting to sort of put yourself in the shoes of the attacker and kind of go, all right, we found that they use some sophisticated compromise to get into, say, a network gateway. They use the 0-day that's just been published. They've got some exploit kit and they've sort of used that to get in. But then once they get in, what are they doing? They're doing basic privesc. They're then looking at network shares. They're opening up Explorer and clicking through directories, all of which leaves very simple sort of forensic breadcrumbs. So it's really hard for an attacker to be sophisticated through the entire attack chain. And even if they change a couple of things to be super sneaky and good, it's not hard to change all of those other things. And there are things that are simple to change. Like there's a thing in our industry called the pyramid of pain, which was devised years ago by a guy called Dave Blasco. And basically it says there are things that are very easy for an attacker to change. Like you can change the IP address of your, the servers that you're using for your data or your C2 or exfil. But to change your entire methodology around how you do an attack at every step is really difficult for an attacker to do. And we use that to our advantage as investigators, because once you start finding those trails that they lose, you just sort of pull those threads and it all unravels. So you do get sophistication in various areas, but it can be hard to do across an entire attack chain.
I suppose it does speak to that level of it's constantly evolving, but also the way in which that the people respond changes dramatically based on the environment as well. So
yeah, you mean like the incident responders and the investigators?
Yeah, absolutely. And the kind of initial access being done, it allows you to, these tactics and procedures have been refined over many, many years, right? So it makes sense to kind of stick to what works in a lot of ways, and not kind of too innovative. I do wonder if that kind of innovation space is left more to state actors and nation states and things of that nature, where the potential risk and impact is even higher. The target is a bit more juicy, if you will.
Yeah, look, yes and no, but one of the things that I have always kept, or one of the things I've really learned and focused on over the years is no matter how technical the work is that we do, at the end of the day, we investigate people, right? And we are very much about, we're a people kind of team, a people business and a people art form. So, and what I mean by that is, when you think about the attackers, again, it's really difficult for them to change all their tactics, all their tech. They might have been taught a certain way, and they continue using those procedures. And if they work, they're going to keep doing it. They might have been taught on certain platforms. So even people in sort of nation state groups, they might be in a team that is very regimented in how they do things, and they do things a certain way. And the greatest sort of weapon that we have as forensic investigators, as responders, is a really good understanding of the techniques that the attackers use. Because the more I'm sure there's a Sun Tzu quote here somewhere from the art form. The more you know about the attacker and how they work, their tools, their techniques, their methods, their habits, their bad habits as well, that's really what you can use to disarm, to find the trails, their breadcrumbs of what they've done, and then to sort of pull those threads and unravel it all. And then the tools, the techniques that you learn for doing that are they're the tools, they're the methods that we use to do that. But really the focus should always be on understanding what the person at the other end is doing, what's their motivation, what's their focus, what's their approach, what are their tools and techniques. Because if you can know that really well, you can disarm them really quickly and really effectively. So we often say we often say that if you think about people who are attacking networks versus people who are defending them, the scales are very much tipped in favor of the people who are attacking, right? Because they can be dynamic, they can evolve their tools and methods quickly, and they don't often have all those other organizational challenges that we have like the layer 8 issues and all the other stuff.
They're a lot more agile. And you can keep banging away at a network until you get in, right? People talk about the defender's dilemma, where you only have to make one mistake and you can let a person in. And that's kind of true. It's not a bad analogy. But when it comes to people who are breaking into systems and people who are investigating that, like the incident responders very much have the advantage, because we know so much about the way that attacks work, and we've become very, very sophisticated at reconstructing that. You might say, well, that's all great, but we'd rather keep the attack out in the first place. But that's where, to complete that cycle, the best defense, organizations who really want to defend themselves from attackers, need to inform themselves about all those attack techniques. So all that intelligence that we have through teams like our, Cyber CX intelligence team, if you can harness all that intel to inform yourself in how you defend yourself, that's when you really become a strong network that gets harder to break into, because you know what the attackers are doing, and you're sort of trying to block that at the early stage rather than just sort of at the back end when you're doing the investigation.
At the point when your team becomes involved, do the intents of the attackers are they generally known to the organization at that point, or is part of the investigation uncovering the intent, like, oh, well, they exfiltrated a bunch of data here, likely it's going to be an extortion or data sale?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess the best way to answer that is if you think about, the sort of threat landscape, as we call it. Who are the attackers and what are they doing? It usually breaks down to cyber criminals and, pure cyber criminals who just want to monetize their breach. And they will, if they're sort of an extortion-based actor, which are most of the big ticket breaches, they're usually going to encrypt your systems through ransomware and then apply pressure on you to pay them to decrypt and get up and running again. Or while they're in your network, they're going to steal data and then say, hey, if you don't give us some money, we're going to disclose that. In the majority of cases, like 70% plus cases, those things happen together. So while they're in your network, they'll steal some data, then they'll try to encrypt your systems, and then they've got kind of two ways to apply pressure on you, right?
Double extortion.
Yeah, double extortion, so called. Then down from that, there's a whole bunch of other cybercrime sort of methods. Business email compromise is probably the next most prevalent. Usually the money involved is less. You're talking hundreds of thousands versus potentially millions for a big extortion case. But the barriers to entry to that can be a little bit lower. And then if you go down that chain of cybercrime, you get into areas like scams and other sort of personal attacks. So that's cyber criminals. And you usually know when you're dealing with those and they're just kind of after money. Nation states, a lot more tricky. They have more strategic targets. They're usually more quiet. They don't tend to announce themselves. They want to stay in the network. They usually yeah, that's right. They're usually driven by espionage. They want to collect information often. But there's always, and there's a growing, I guess, concern if you look at the press and the releases from sort of Five Eyes governments around nation-state attackers who will burrow into networks and stay there and potentially have that access to come back later on if they want to sort of escalate attacks. The blur, and then you get other areas like internal investigations where you have maybe an internal employee who does something, and you need to be really tricky, really careful with those because they can be tricky. I mean, there's a lot of bias that can creep in when you do investigations. That's one of the things that we're always careful of, is not going into an investigation with preconceived notions. Oh, this horrible person's done something bad and we need to investigate it. Because sometimes you investigate the horrible person and you go, you know what? Actually, what they did isn't that bad. And actually their motivations aren't that evil. But if you go in a really blinkered way, it can really skew you off course. But just lastly, there's also a grey area between those. And one of the big grey areas is between nation states and cyber criminals, because there are nation states who will attack organizations and make it look like a cyber criminal. It'll look like a ransomware attack, but when you look at their techniques and their methods and the way they operate and the way we engage with them, because we often engage with cyber attackers as part of our work, you kind of go, this is not a criminal actor. This is a nation state actor carrying out more strategic kind of objectives here, just sort of with the veil of a cyber crime. So it can be, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, it can be obvious sometimes. It can be a little bit sort of shady and sometimes as well.
Makes complete sense. I mean, as such would be the nature of investigations. They're not always going to be the same, and the breadcrumbs left over are all going to be, I guess, slightly different, as much as they all form that category of tactics, procedures, etc.
Can I ask, is it frustrating to go through the entire forensics journey into the incident response? You've identified the APT or the cyber criminal, and the only consequence for them, I suppose, is that they're kicked out of the system. You can't ever grab hold of this person or group of people and say, okay, now here are some consequences for you.
Stay out.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting, I've never been asked that question. Is it frustrating that there's not more consequences?
It's not like sending someone, like in a normal, like everyday traditional in-person crime, there's a trial, the person is remanded, and then that consequence starts for whatever that punishment is. I'm just wondering if it's a bit frustrating when it's a bit more faceless like that. Even if you do have a name for them, it is
it's a really interesting question. I think it is to a degree, but I think it's also I think there's a general level of acceptance that a lot of these actors are overseas. They're in regions and geographies where they can run with relative kind of impunity. In some cases, they're even encouraged by their governments to do this kind of stuff. In some cases, they're directed, right? I think what's more frustrating for a lot of organizations that have these breaches is that they feel that they don't get enough help. Because, we have a lot of people who come to us who are individuals who have had something happen, and they feel that their phone computer's been compromised, or their email account, or their Facebook account, or whatever. And oftentimes they're people who have had something happen in their personal life. They're seeing something happen on their technologies. They don't quite understand it, and they just need help, right? And they just find it really difficult that they feel that there's nowhere they can go that can really help them. And then it's always been one of the sort of policies in our team for years is we genuinely want to help people, even folks that we might not eventually get engaged with and do sort of paid work for. We do a lot of pro bono work through the CyberCX team, and it's something we're quite proud of because, if you look at the people in our team and what we do this for, the thread that runs through our team is everyone wants to help others. We talk about securing and protecting our communities. We take it really, really seriously, and we do want to help people. And I think the frustration that we often see, and not just from individuals, but right up to organizations, is why isn't anyone helping me with this? Why can't I get more assistance with what's going on? So I think that's the thing that we need to really focus on in Australia, is being able to have those mechanisms to help organizations who get into these problems, and the individuals as well. There has been more action from law enforcement and governments against some of these overseas attack groups. You see every now and then there's some disruption, there's some takedowns of websites, there's some takeovers, there's further activity. So I think that governments and law enforcement are definitely steadily increasing their activity and their rewards, but there's still a long way to go. But that's a difficult challenge to solve. And it goes into areas of geopolitics and other things that are usually beyond the realms of sort of most organizations that find themselves victims to these crimes.
Do you think it's due to as well that ever looming, ever discussed cybersecurity skill shortage that we are kind of facing in the future, assuming we aren't able to get enough individuals involved and in that mission of securing our communities? Is that part of what's preventing people having a place to go to?
Yes and no. Look, I think we could have 10 times the number of incident responders in Australia next week. I don't think it would make a massive dent in the amount of cyber crime that we're experiencing. We'd be able to respond to it a lot, probably at a larger scale. I don't think the issue is with response. I think if we're going to put a big dent in cyber crime and cyber attacks, I think the key things we need to do are continue educating organizations about what they need to do, continue focusing organizations on where they get the most bang for their buck in terms of securing themselves, and spreading that message and providing the capabilities for organizations to secure themselves against the current threats that we're facing. I often say, I've spent my whole career in sort of cybersecurity, and most of it helping organizations respond to attacks. And these days I spend a lot of time with sort of boards and senior executives, helping them think of the more sort of holistic challenges, not answering the individual questions. How do we do a better pen test? How do we do a better this or that? But more, how do we deal with this challenge for our organization at a more strategic level? And I'll often say one of the best ways for an organization to know if they're well prepared for an incident is actually, again, to do like a tabletop exercise, to map out what an incident would look like if it hit them. Coming back to what I said earlier, we spend a lot of time presenting on the doom and gloom of cyber, and here are the attackers and here are the attackers, and here's how big and challenging and nasty this is. The silver lining to this cloud is get all of that intelligence and knowledge that we have about attacks and use that to focus on your own organization and say, if we had a breach tomorrow, how would that actually look? How would that play out? Let's go through it step by step and understand what are the particular challenges that we would face and how well prepared are we to deal with them, right? And then find all those areas where you're not well prepared enough and do something. Because the vast majority of what happens in a cyber breach, and I mean like 90% plus of what you're going to have to deal with, you can play out ahead of time. So don't wait for the incident to occur and then sort of go, oh, I wonder if we're ready or not. Go through it proactively, and then you'll get a really great insight into where your weaknesses are, and then fix all of them. And then at least you'll be able to say as an organization, we have done as much as we can to be prepared for the current, sort of attackers that we know about. And I think that's what we need to. So we would say skill shortage. Skills are very important. I think awareness is really important. And then just engaging with organizations, sharing our expertise and our intelligence, and then really helping them to focus on what is the most important areas that they need to focus their attention and effort and investment in to get the most bang for their buck and really be well prepared.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting. A way of stating it, in that the skills gap might be more on the organization side with their awareness rather than for a career in cyber.
Yeah, and I think that, again, I've been in this industry since the sort of very early days. We haven't, I still think we haven't done a good enough job as an industry to make it easy enough. When I talk to a lot of boards and senior execs, they are worried about cybersecurity, and they really don't understand it well enough. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think it is a complex challenge. And sometimes we can oversimplify it. I think sometimes we have vendors and people who are sort of pushing products that sort of put themselves forward as this silver bullet. Install this on your network and you will be safe from attackers. Like, no, you won't. It's not that easy.
No, ever 100% proof.
Yeah, totally. And I often say this when I present to boards and execs on cyber breaches, but also when we go and help organizations who have had breaches, we always say, this is not an IT problem, right? Don't think that this is just something that your IT department can deal with, because when you have a cyber breach, you're going to have legal issues to deal with. You're going to have comms issues. You're going to have to deal with various stakeholders, from government to law enforcement to customers to business partners. You're going to have internal issues to deal with. You're going to have technology issues to deal with. The range of impacts that a cyber breach has is so multifaceted, and the IT bit is critical because it's very much a core element. But these are not IT issues anymore. These are whole of organization issues
with the gumball all around.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
I didn't.
Yeah,
sorry. Go ahead.
No, go on.
We spoke to Alistair McGibbon recently around cyber extortion and ransomware more broadly, and an interesting aspect he really brought up was the empathy around organizations going through these breaches, as well as they are victims and should be seen as such. You can't really always point the finger and say, well, you should have done X and Y, because ultimately they are victims. And, I would imagine having such a close relationship with some of these boards and staff that have gone through an incident, the emotions must be really high strung. And so to your point about doing those simulations, like the ACCS exercise in a box, trying to facilitate people getting ahead of what this stress might actually look like if you're in a room. And I think that's an invaluable piece of advice, that if organizations are looking to get a real sense of what could happen, do one of those.
Yeah, it's so true. And, what I said earlier rings true again and again. What we do is all about people, right? And when you're doing a major breach, I'll give you one example. When we do a major breach, if you're dealing with a cyber criminal, where that they just want to make some money, they want to extort the organization, apply some pressure and get some money out of them, there is a possibility that that organization needs to consider that horrible question: would we ever pay a ransom? Now, having helped countless organizations through that question, held their hands and sort of walked them through the thinking, you can't decide that in an hour. You can't just get your board together and go, right, here's our agenda item, we're going to pay a ransom. Because if you do that, you fail to recognize that these are human beings, and that's a really difficult thing for them to work through. And I've seen situations where on day one of a breach, I remember a breach we did years ago where the CEO said to me on the first day they were walking around the office with their credit card going, "Can someone tell me how I get Bitcoin on this so we can just pay?" Right? And then 3 days later, after we'd come in and we kind of worked through and we were able to get their data back, they were like, "No, we're never going to pay. And thank God we didn't do it on day one." But we know that you're never going to, you need time to process that thinking and go on that emotional roller coaster, which is why often we'll bring up that issue when we think that it might become an inevitability, and we'll start having that discussion with the board and the senior execs, not so they can make a decision on the spot, but so they can start thinking about it and understanding it and knowing what the risks are involved and unpacking that question for them in all its ways. Because it may be that in a week or two, as the situation proceeds, you might need to actually make that decision, and you want them to be well armed and prepared. And that I've used the example of paying a ransom. That applies to so many other aspects of dealing with an incident, whether it's the comms that you put out to your customers, how you deal with your third parties, how you look after your staff. These are all ultimately people challenges, and you need to keep that sort of personal mindset all the time. And if you do, then you sort of navigate your way through that really challenging incident in the best possible way.
Absolutely. I think more empathy around how some of these things occur is also really, an important part of bringing these discussions to boards and people that have gone through incidents like this. Is it something that you think, I mean, obviously the paying of the ransom is a very kind of gray area. There's a lot of people that are firmly on we never pay. There's someone that, well, you can pay sometime. I'm not going to obviously say, do you pay? But there is a degree of, I even think, engaging in the negotiation with those actors, that buys you time. That gives you more information. Like you said, for investigation, it's all about painting the picture. So the hesitancy to engage with these actors, as much as they are criminals and such, can actually be of benefit when you are victimized in that way.
Yeah, so we have a really good publication, which I encourage everyone to read, which is our best practice guide to ransomware and cyber extortion. We released the first version of that years ago when there was a real rapid increase in those kinds of breaches against Australian organizations. And in that is basically our methodology on how you deal with those breaches, including our decision trees on how to make those decisions. Do you pay or do you not pay? We very deliberately just published that to help organizations through those questions, because we realized that while instances of breaches were going up, there wasn't enough good thought leadership out there helping people through those really tricky challenges. Now, and when we talk about engagement with an attacker, we always say there's 3 reasons you engage with an attacker. A lot of people think that you just engage with an attacker when you want to negotiate a payment. That's one reason you might want to, but that's actually the last reason you would engage. The other reasons you engage would be to firstly try to control their actions. Because if you've got an attacker out there and they're determined to cause you harm and disruption, they might publish samples of stolen data online.
They'll get impatient.
They might get impatient. We've seen attackers who have gone out to security researchers and told them about the breach. We've seen attackers who have their own marketing groups, believe it or not, who will go out and publicize it. Now, we've seen attackers who have contacted the organization, started contacting employees or contacted the help desk. We did one, actually we've done a couple of breaches where the attackers get on the company's website and get on the web blog thing and say, "Hi, can you help me today? I've broken into your company. You need to talk to me." You want to stop them doing that, right? And one way,
fear-mongering.
One way you can stop them doing that is by engaging them, by contacting them and saying, "Hi, let's talk." Because if they believe that they're engaged in a dialogue that might get them somewhere, you can at least try to get them to stop doing that stuff. The second reason you engage with them is to try to get information. And one of the key bits of information that you will often try to obtain is, what did they steal, right? Because you can use all sorts of really clever digital forensics means to try to reconstruct what data they accessed and they stole. That can be really difficult. That's one of the areas of forensic analysis that can be really difficult to prove. But we often say, ironically, the person who knows best what was stolen is the person who stole it. So if you engage with them, you can try to get that or other information. And the third reason, if or when you need it, is to talk about payment. But again, going back to your point, we have really, really well born methodologies on how to do this. And it's one area where most people sort of think about it a little bit, or they might have, one-line rule, or we will never pay an attacker because you're perpetuating criminal activity. It's like, well, yeah, you are. That's the reality of it, right? But that's not in itself a good enough reason to not do it. You need to know all of the other considerations, and you need to think of, because ultimately it's a risk decision. What are all the reasons? What are all the risks to paying? What are all the risks to not paying? What can you do to, minimize those risks as much as possible? When you do all those things, kind of where do you land? And there are some situations where it's just so obvious that once you do that assessment, of course we're not going to pay because we don't need to. Or, yeah, we really do need to pay because no matter what we do, we still have this massive risk and we just cannot manage that. And it's so significant that, horrible as it is, we may need to consider making a payment. But the methodology for going through that is kind of well established these days.
It's great, and it's amazing to have such a dedicated resource like CyberCX to just put this information out freely. Because you could easily turn around and say, well, now we're charging everyone in order to engage with this paywall process. So the fact that kind of guidance is provided freely for the benefit of securing our communities is something that speaks to what CyberCX and phishing and the employees here really strive to do.
So it shouldn't be extensive to get justice. This should be something that we're all sort of empathetic towards. Yeah.
We're always really careful of that. Look, I mean, again, going back to there can be a lot of shades of grey in our industry. We'll sometimes see organizations in our cyber intelligence work that have had a breach. We'll see evidence out there on the dark web that an organization has had a breach. Occasionally we will contact that organization and say, hey, listen, we're out there, we're kind of patrolling the internet. We've seen some stuff about you that we need to share with you, right? And some people go, oh, you can't do that. That's ambulance chasing. It's like, well, it's not. There are some organizations who do that, and then they'll contact the victims and say, we know some stuff about you, but you need to pay us to provide you this report. And we have we have very firm policies on this. We will never, ever, ever do that. We will always say, while we were out, doing what we do, we saw this stuff. Here is everything we've seen. Here's everything we've got. Here's our assessment. Here's our advice. There's no compulsion to engage us. It's all free. Do with this what you want, right? Every single time we've done that as an organization, the response has been, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Sometimes they'll say, this is great. We didn't know this. We'll take it from here. And we'll go, yeah, fine, fantastic. Sometimes they'll say, this is great. We actually don't really know how to do those next steps. So can you help us? And we'll come in and help. But our philosophy is always, we are there to help. We are there to help. We are not here to capitalize on anyone's, horrible situation. Because that's what we do. Again, for us, protecting communities isn't just some tagline. It's a very genuine thing that drives kind of what we do every day.
It's a great philosophy.
Yeah, it's really important.
It's also funny because I do think the industry's reception to free, unsolicited, helpful cyber advice has changed dramatically. Even in that, back in the day, like the 90s, there used to be a bug tracker with a queue going around where people would list all the 0 days. They'd reach out to the company and say, hey, I found this, you might want to patch it. And they're like, if you ever look around in our software again, we'll throw you in jail. And now I think it's a lot more, thanks for letting us know, like the bug bounty programs, there's actual incentives to be on that side of the information provision.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's where this is how we can really disarm the attackers, right? If we know that an attacker has a new technique that they're using, best thing we can do is scan for it and look for it and find other people who are vulnerable. They say, hey, listen, you need to know about this, right? The more we share intelligence in that proactive way, the more we help each other as the people who are defending networks, the harder we make it for the people who are breaking in. So that kind of sharing should be encouraged. Now, it has to be ethical. It has to be done right. It has to be done with, consider. We're not going to go, hey, this company over here got hacked like this, and we're telling you about it. It's like, well, that's not really good. But if you do it the right way with, professionalism and ethics and consideration, then that makes a huge difference. And that's, again, what kind of drives us.
Nick, thank you so much for your time. If I had one last question to ask you, it would be, what would you say to anyone looking to get into digital forensics, incident response? Like, what advice would you give them to, there's probably no better time than now people, display their interest aside from the CyberCX Academy? Obviously, AWSN has many opportunities for different cohorts. Do you have any other insights?
That's an interesting question. I think I'd probably answer it in a slightly reverse way. What do we look for in people who are really good at this? The advice I'd give to anyone who wants to get into something is figure out if it's for you. Yeah, that's right. We get a lot of people who, we get so many people who, I have digital forensics in my dream. It's what I want to do. It's like, great. What are you interested in? I don't know. It just sounds really cool. So you may not be cut out for it. What I look for, and I've learned this over many, many years of sort of hiring people and building teams, is firstly, you got to have a love of technology. Like Beck said, when you said I would pore over logs for ages looking at stuff, that's like tick. Because our people we love, you love getting your hands dirty. You love getting in there. You love knowing how stuff works. You love getting to the core and really crawling through and looking for clues and joining the dots, even when you're going down paths that they're going to get you nowhere. That kind of love of the deeply technical is a fantastic attribute. People who love solving puzzles, because at the end of the day, that's, what we do. We're given a situation, we need to solve it. We don't know what the answer is, and sometimes you don't even know if you've got the full answer, but that's kind of what drives you. There's an analogy that a good investigator is like a hunting dog. You let them go, and they just go, and they will go and go and go, or hunt and hunt and hunt until they either get what they're hunting, or you call them back, right? And they just will not relent, and that's true. And the third attribute that I always look for is you want to help people. Because I think if that is the motivation that drives you, you will be exceptional at investigation and response. And if you put those three attributes together, that's where to go. So people that want to get into it, I think if that resonates with you, you might have a good prospective career in sort of DFIR work, and then go out and get some experience. There's a lot of CTFs you can do online that are free. Go play with them. There are training courses you can do. There's more free training that you can do online, which is great as a way of getting introduced to it. There are some fantastic free tool sets that you can download to start exploring evidence. You can analyze your own computers and see what you can recover about your own activity. So it's a much more accessible field than it used to be. And then if you want to step up into the more sort of professional realm, there are paid training courses you can do. Some of them could be, really expensive, but then start looking for opportunities to sort of find your way into that field. Look for a incident response team or a digital forensics team that's hiring, that's looking for people to give them experience. There's also tangential ways to get in. So like I said, we've brought fantastic people into our team over the years who have come from pen testing, and they bring their own unique sort of perspective on looking at what an attacker did. I've seen people pivoting from being SOC analysts to, they have that sort of grounding in log analysis and responding to tickets and detections that then sort of pivots into incident response. So there's different ways to sort of come into it if you don't get your first spot in an incident response team. Yeah.
That's awesome. I mean, plenty of stuff for people to get dirty with. I think, there's no shortage of resources and support for people getting into cyber if you are interested. So I similarly encourage everyone. I got started on just analyzing my own network with my friends living in the house and seeing what they're all up to. So I think start small and just see if you're into it. I think that's the best way to take it.
And I'm sure you had their permission to do that as well.
Oh, always.
Disclaimer, yes.
Nick, thank you so much for your time today. It was not only enlightening, but incredibly insightful to the industry. I think it's one that's not only gone through rapid change over the course of many years, but it's something that is a very core aspect of what cybersecurity is to people's understanding of it as a layman. So absolutely unbelievable for your time and generosity. Really, thank you.
Yeah, a real pleasure today, Nick. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thanks, Benji. Thanks, Vic. See you next time.
All the best. We'll see you next time.